Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Hamlin, Executive Director for the Center for Election Science. And today we are going to be talking about why our current voting method, plurality voting, the choose one voting method, is so bad. So I'll be starting it off by talking about just in general some of the issues with plurality voting, and then we can move to a Q&A session on some of the questions that you have, looking at why it is that we are using this terrible voting method, as well as like some of the issues that come up, some of the answers. If you look to the comment section, you should be able to, so not on the bottom of the video, but there's that section on the right. You can use that to include your own questions throughout this. So curious. Well, looks like Tara is noting that it's on the bottom for mobile. So if you're using your phone, it's going to be on the bottom section. So a little bit of a different interface. So I'm also curious where folks are from as well. So it looks like we've got Rebecca from Long Beach, California. That's awesome. I'm coming from Chicago, Illinois. So it's getting a little warmer here. And let's see. Anyone else? Where I'm curious where other folks are coming in from. We may. We've got Rudy from Las Vegas. Another person, Colin from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Oakland, California. So maybe splitting places a little bit. Cool. Well, feel free to chime in with the chat. I look forward to seeing where everybody's coming in from. Harrisburg is where Tara is coming from. And we've got our staff member, Caitlin, from Denver. We've got Greg from San Francisco. Cool. With Polyscribe. And passionate about improving democracy. Cool. Looks like we got a good bunch here, and I'm looking forward to it. So there's so this particular Q&A session is focused around why all the ways that our choose one voting method fails us. And there's one really nice article that we've got in on our site. This one in particular. And so what this is it looks at the kind of the top reasons why our choose one voting method is bad. And so for those just looking at this and thinking like, well, like I'm not sure exactly what you mean by voting method, could be all kinds of different things, and not sure what you mean by that choose one voting method. So normally when you go to vote, you're forced to choose a particular candidate, and then the candidate with the most votes wins. So here we're talking about things like mayoral elections, governor elections. You're forced to choose just one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. Well, it turns out there's a bunch of different ways to do that. So add one more on what is a voting method. And that's a helpful article too, just to give a framework of what we're talking about. So add in that here. So what is a voting method? And so when we're talking about voting methods, what we mean is that the information that you put on the ballot, how that information segment. So like you can choose just one candidate, which is the way that we do it now. You can offer information that ranks candidates, score them on a scale. You can choose or approve as many candidates as you want. There are all kinds of different ways of providing information. Then you have to do something with that information. So if you're choosing one candidate, what are you doing with that information? So normally we just add it up, and then the candidate with the most votes wins. So what you do with that information doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it is complicated depending on the voting method, but it doesn't have to be. So you can, like, for instance, take ranking information, use that to simulate sequential runoffs. You can use that to simulate pairwise comparisons to see which candidate is able to beat everyone else head to head. You can take information on letting people choose as many candidates as they want, and then take like the average approvals per candidate. So there are all sorts of things that you can do with this information. Then you show the result, which provides the winner, whoever got the most support, however that's measured, and then using that measure to also figure out how much support everyone else got, those folks who didn't win. So that's what we mean when we're talking about a voting method. And the current voting method that we have is just this choose one voting method. So that is, you go to the ballot box, you pick one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. And I think a lot of people, they look at that and they think, well, what's the big deal with that? That's how we've always done it. We get a winner. What's wrong here? And so if you look at that top 5 ways that plurality voting fails, we've got your kind of classic number list of all the ways that things go wrong. So one is, it's when you're forced to choose just one candidate. This is really an inexpressive way of offering information. So when you're voting, this is really the one opportunity when you can't be ignored. When you cast your ballot, like the government officials, they can't ignore that. And so it's a real shame that in this circumstance, when you're casting your ballot, you are offering the least amount of information possible. So if you think about it, like you can think back and think, okay, well, we talked about the different components of a voting method, that information that you're providing, that calculation that you do with that information to produce a result. But this first segment, like you have to have something to start with. You can't do any kind of calculations on the absence of information. And so when you're forced to choose just one candidate, the issue is like, are you talking about like the degree that you like a particular candidate? Are you providing any information on the other candidates? Well, you're not. And so if you think about it, you really can't offer any less information than choosing only one candidate. There are all kinds of ways that you can offer information. This particular way that you like one candidate more than the others, well, you can only look at it as like the one candidate that you voted for relative to everyone else, and everyone else is lumped in one large block. You can't tell the degree between those candidates, like the one that you like and all the other ones, and you can't differentiate between any individual candidates other than the one that you chose and everyone else. And so as a consequence, like we get this very poor reflection of support for all these candidates because we're not offering any information. You need it, regardless of how good the calculation process is, it doesn't do any good if you don't offer any information to begin with. And so that's what we mean when we talk about expressiveness. So another factor to consider with this choose one voting method is the spoiler effect. So one of the kind of the classic examples is with Nader in 2000. So in 2000, we had an election with Bush, Gore, Ralph Nader of the Green Party, and there were some other candidates on the list as well. And in Florida of that election, there was a court case going on, but within the ballots that were taken that were used for the result, the Bush had gotten more votes than Gore in the state of Florida, and as a consequence, that was material in determining the number of electoral votes that went to Bush overall, causing him to win the election. Interestingly, Nader, the Green Party candidate in that election, also got a bunch of votes in Florida. In fact, the votes that he had were able to make up the difference between Bush and Gore. So assuming that all of those votes had gone, all those people who had voted for Nader, who was more on the left, more similarly aligned with Gore than with Bush. Had all those votes gone to Gore instead, Gore would have been the winner of that election. And so we consider Nader to be a spoiler in that election because had Nader not run, we assume that those votes would have instead gone to Gore, or at least enough of them to have caused Gore to have won the election. Interestingly, in that election, a lot of folks will also point out that there were a bunch of other third-party candidates on the Florida ballot, and the margin of victory in Florida was very small for that particular election. And even a lot of the left-aligned third-party candidates had also made up the margin of victory between the difference between Gore and Bush in that election. So technically, Nader wasn't the only spoiler in that election. There were a lot of other candidates who, had they not been in the race, Gore would have won. So the idea of a spoiler overall is that you enter a race, you don't win, and yet your presence in the race causes the winner to change. And so we normally see this as a consequence of vote splitting, which is something that is really very quite common in our choose one voting method. So you imagine yourself, say, as say you're a Nader supporter in the year 2000 in this election, and you're in Florida, and so you're looking at your ballot and you're thinking, well, I really like Nader in this instance, but at the same time, I don't want Bush to win, and you're really in a dilemma. And so if you say, like, you know what, I really want to support this candidate, and you vote for them anyway, there's a real risk there that you cause yourself a worse outcome, assuming that you also prefer Gore to Bush. That happens quite frequent. That's a more prominent example in our elections, using the Florida 2020, the Florida 2000 election. But we see this all the time in local elections as well, this idea of a spoiler effect. And so let's see, we've got some things in there from the chat. So the Bernie Democratic nomination, whether that was subject to a spoiler effect. So we do have some data on that from the right before the Super Tuesday. So this is an interesting article. And so looking at this, what we do see with that particular snapshot in time, we see that the winner didn't change in that particular election. So not so much a spoiler with that particular snapshot in time, but it could have been within the state level. So with that particular article I shared, which was right before Super Tuesday, that used a national sample. But if we were to, say, look at a subset of the population, say a particular state that was having their primary, we would get a different type of capture with that information. And within the Democratic primary, we had a number of candidates who ran that were similar. So here, thinking of similarities between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, certainly there's room for vote splitting there. And as a consequence, that could allow someone who is perhaps more conservative within the Democratic Party to be able to move forward and take advantage of that vote splitting between Sanders and Warren. Within our particular sample, we didn't see that, but we were looking at a national sample. But when you break it down with within state level data, it's possible that could happen. It's difficult for us to be able to see that and draw any firm conclusions, because really, in order to be able to assess that, you need to be able to capture the data to begin with. But when you're not able to do that, it's challenging to be able to make those differences unless they are perhaps a little bit more glaring. So we've got one question from Colin, what is the minimum, maximum, ideal number of candidates in an approval voting election? Um, so, so Colin is asking about another voting method called approval voting. And approval voting is, and we can maybe share in there. There's one article that is really nice introduction for this. This is our approval voting 101 article. I'll just share that in there. So approval voting allows you to pick as many candidates as you want, and the candidate with the most votes wins. So normally you're limited to choosing only one. Approval voting lets you pick as many as you want. So the question there is, how many is good for an approval voting election? With any kind of election that you have, or it's kind of like sampling. Like if you're taking some kind of sample of data, you want the largest sample as practicable in order to trying to estimate like what's going on with the big picture. And so if you're doing that within a context when you only have so many people, like say 10 or 12, if that's like your whole group, then that's probably fine. If your group is larger, say thousands of people, you probably want to have more people vote than that, regardless of the voting method that you're using. Another component in thinking about, and here we're kind of diving in a little bit to comparing voting methods and thinking about which voting method works for certain particular circumstances. If you have like a sophisticated group, one approach you could take is to use a method called score voting, which is the information that you provide is scoring each candidate on a scale, say 0 to 5, and it doesn't have to be a candidate like a person. It could be like an option of a thing to do. And you take the option that has the highest average and choose that as your winner. When you have a very small group, say like 5 or 10 people, it may be useful to use something that uses a scale where you're scoring your options on the scale and then taking the one with the highest average or the highest total and going with that one. And the reason for that is because when you have a very low sample, you increase your risk of ties, which is true with any voting method. But when you're using a method like score or range voting, when you have this entire scale, the permutations reduce the likelihood of a tie in that instance. The other instance is that when you have a smaller sample size, if there's this thing in survey sampling where if you increase the sensitivity of your measurement instrument, you reduce the error and you increase the accuracy a bit. And if you have a small sample, using range or score voting when you're assessing them on a scale, that can help to reduce that error and adjust that. But when you have a larger sample, like say an election for a city, and you've got thousands and thousands of people, that becomes less of an issue. And so the sample size itself is another way to address that error and to gain that accuracy. So I hope that was a little bit of a technical question. So I hope that that helps and doesn't throw people off too much. So let's look at one of the other issues with why our current choose one voting method is so bad. So we talked about the spoiler, where a candidate can run, and the presence of them running, even though they don't win, can cause a worse outcome. And so that's something that's really frustrating for voters, because as a voter, when you really like a candidate, it can't feel good at all when you're voting for a candidate who really speaks to the ideals that you care about, and you're telling people like, "Oh, I voted for this candidate. They have all these great ideas," and then all your friends point to you and they say, "I don't know why you voted for that candidate. That candidate was a spoiler. Because of that candidate, we all got this terrible person elected." That feels terrible, and it can't feel good for the candidate themselves either, because obviously they run because they care about democracy, care about their community, and to have all of the people in their circle to say like, "Hey, how dare you run for office and cause this other person that nobody likes to win. It has to feel terrible for them as well. So everybody gets a worse outcome. And both the person running for office and all the people that voted for them get lambasted as a result. And the unfortunate part with this is that when we look at the situation, we're blaming a lot of people here when really it's not the people themselves that really warrant the blame. It's the voting method. It's because it doesn't have to be this way, as we'll talk about later. But this is the world that we live in as a consequence of using really the worst voting method that there is. So kind of going to the next one, which is favorite betrayal. Favorite betrayal is when you choose a candidate who really isn't your favorite under this choose one voting method. So the idea of within plurality voting or this first past the post or this choose one voting method that we use, all those mean the same thing. If we find ourselves in the situation where say we go back and you're that Nader voter again in 2000 and you're living in Florida, and so you're in this dilemma and you're thinking like I really want to vote for Nader in this situation, but I'm aware of all the consequences that are that could happen here, and so I'm not going to vote for Nader. I'm going to vote for Gore instead to ensure that like Bush in that election doesn't win. And so, and in that scenario, perhaps you've helped ensure a better outcome for you as an individual if you have preferences of Nader substantially, and then behind that Gore, and then Bush behind that. If those are your preferences, and you find yourself supporting Gore with your choose one ballot, you've done what's called favorite betrayal, and you've betrayed your honest favorite candidate. And while that's given you a better outcome and that you didn't cause a spoiler in this election, what you have done is you've hurt the support for the candidate that you really like. And again, this is something like we look at 2000 as a famous example, but this is something that happens all across the U.S. And that we see third parties, independents run, maybe even someone say within a Republican Party primary, where voters like a particular candidate, but they feel like that candidate isn't going to win, and they don't choose that particular person, and they choose someone else instead. We see this concept of favorite betrayal all over the place, and not just in that classic 2000 election, but we see it at the local elections all the time. So, as a consequence, what's happening there is that these candidates that are bringing ideas that we really care about, they aren't getting the traction that they deserve. So, ideally, what we would like to see is when a candidate brings good ideas to the table, we'd like to see that reflection of the support match like how good their ideas are, and the way that they resonate with voters. But if voters have to take in mind calculus like, well, what are their chances of winning? How much money do they have? That completely distorts the picture of the merits of these individual candidates. And that's exactly what happens when we betray our favorite under this choose one voting method. And again, it's not, it's, when we're looking at an individual and we're saying like, hey, like, I see that you chose this other candidate, like we're having a conversation, you're telling me who you're voting for, and you're saying, I voted for this other candidate because I didn't think that my favorite candidate was going to win. It's hard to blame a person too much for that, for them for betraying their favorite. So we can't really get too angry at them. And I think in a lot of times when we're talking about politics, we get mad at individual candidates when they're running, and we get mad at individual voters sometimes too. But we also have to keep in mind the practicality of we are using really the worst voting method that there is, and particularly when it has all these issues like encouraging people to vote against their own interest and betray their favorite and give them this artificially low support compared to what they actually deserve. We're going to look a little bit at the questions before we transition to the next one. So another question asking about plurality voting is really an issue outside of winner-take-all elections. And then referencing proportional representation. So here that's a good point. So when we're talking about this choose one voting method that we have, we're talking about it within the context of single winner elections. And so when we're talking about single winner elections, that it really is winner take all. So when we hear the term winner take all, what that means is a single winner election. And perhaps the reason we see that term a bit more in the US, so like when we're looking at a lot of other places like European countries that use proportional representation, and proportional representation means that people are elected in proportion to the support and in proportion to the voter support that they get. So like if some ideology gets 10% of the vote, they will get roughly 10% of the seats. So in the US, we do something kind of weird in that we take these legislatures, and instead of electing them at large as a legislative body, we take them and we divide them up into these single member districts. And within a single member district, we have these winner take all elections, because whoever wins that single winner district, they win everything. So it's winner take all in that essence. And so as a consequence, you run into this dilemma where if you didn't get, say you voted for someone within your district who was running, and that person got didn't win, but say they got like 40% of the vote or something. Even though they got 40% of the vote, all those people, including you who voted for that person, they get just nothing. So with proportional representation, if that same kind of reflection of support scaled up at a larger scale, that 40% who voted for some other ideology, they would get roughly 40% of the seats rather than nothing. And that can come into play in a number of instances. So we may look at, like, we may think of things like gerrymandering and other things, but one thing to keep in mind is that even a consequence of using the single member districts, which is where we see plurality voting, this choose one voting method, is that like even if we say like do computer line drawing, you can have dispersion of an ideology pretty broadly across a geographic area. And if you do that, then it doesn't matter how you draw those lines, you won't be able to pick that up. You won't be able to pack a segment of people who uh, uh, go along with that ideology. You just can't pick those people up without a proportional voting method in order to be able to capture them when an ideology is geographically dispersed like that. And so I think that's something that's often overlooked when we're thinking about using proportional methods versus, say, this winner-take-all system that we find ourselves stuck in. Right, and going through some of the more some other questions here. Yeah, and there are a bunch of different types of proportional voting methods, and we can go over those maybe a little bit at the end, or it may be more appropriate to have that in a different segment. So one question. So comparing. So we're talking about our choose one voting method now, but it's important to realize there are a bunch of different voting methods, and one of the methods that we advance at the Center for Election Science, approval voting, does quite a bit better on a number of these. And so one question is asking the type of winner that you would typically get with approval voting, and also asking about the percentages. Because if you're used to looking at plurality vote percentages, it can look a little when you're looking at approval vote percentages. So again, this choose one voting method, or plurality voting, so you choose one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. You break down of the percentage of votes that each candidate has. With approval voting, you are the voter is essentially asked to choose all the candidates that they approve of, and the candidate with the most votes or approvals wins. And there, because you can approve multiple candidates, if you took up and added all the approvals, the percentage of voters that approved of a particular candidate, and you did that for everybody, you would wind up with a total of more than 100%, because assuming that people that at least one person chooses more than one candidate. And so you can have like, technically you can have multiple candidates with approval percentages above 50%, and the rule that you take there is just the candidate that has the most votes or the highest approval. Those are going to be the same thing. And then you also tend to see a better reflection of support for other candidates who don't win as well. And you can see that a bit more in the article that we had done for the Super Tuesday election. So I'll add that again in there. And go ahead and segment back to the next on our list in terms of why plurality voting is so bad. So another reason that plurality voting is so bad is that you get these partisan winners as a consequence. And so what I mean by that is that there's this, and again, this and reference this article here, which is the top 5 list of why plurality voting is so bad. And when you look at that particular one, if you scroll on down to number 2, partisan winners, you see this normal distribution where the x-axis is looking at political ideology, and the y-axis is the number of voters. And interestingly, when you do that, you can imagine, say, a candidate that is really like a perfect candidate, put them right in the middle, and that candidate is reflecting the political will of the broadest breadth of the electorate within that particular example that you can see in that normal distribution, that bell curve distribution. And that's the orange triangle right in the center there. So here you can see that candidate would really be the best winner overall. And if you took that candidate, they would be able to beat everyone else in a head-to-head election. But if, say, you add some other candidates, so say you added 2 candidates to one side, 2 candidates to the other side, and you asked, okay, well, who wins now? Now that we've added these other candidates, well, under plurality voting, and have that election, and it can support, and the winner can be a candidate who wins that is 2 levels out from that candidate in the middle. So you've got a candidate who is center right, and then you've got another one who's even further out to the right, and that candidate can win for and they do so merely because of vote splitting in the center. And we call this the center squeeze effect. And it may not be completely obvious why this happens, but if you look at it and you think, okay, well, when we think about vote splitting, how does that happen? Well, vote splitting happens when you have candidates who have similar ideologies, and you're not able to provide information about multiple of those candidates in a way that's usable by the voting method. And so the candidate in the middle, only those voters in the middle align best with that candidate relative to the other options that they have. And so as a consequence, the vote divides between that candidate in the middle and there's other centrist type candidates as well on the left and right of that candidate. And as a consequence, the vote for the candidate in the middle splits on either side of that candidate. And the same thing for those candidates alongside of it. So if you look to the candidate on the center left and the center right, there's vote splitting on both sides of both of those candidates. And so they're really getting this fraction of the support that they deserve for the mere fact of all this vote splitting. But when you look at the candidate on the right, for instance, and the same thing is true for the candidate on the left. It just happens to be in the circumstance the candidate on the right is winning. But the candidate on the right, their vote is split only on one side. So that candidate on the right, their vote is split with the center right candidate. And that's it. They don't have anyone on the right because they're on the farther end of the spectrum. And as a consequence, their vote is split on one side, and they pick up that entire tail of that distribution of voters. And so that's why they win. And this is why our choose one voting method can favor partisan winners, particularly when we have a crowded field. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Ideally, we would like a candidate to win who is more of a consensus style candidate, so a candidate who appeals to the broadest mass of the electorate. So taking a quick peek at some of the other questions here. So there's one question asking about ranked choice voting, and whether it's technically like a choose one voting method. So I would say that it's not a choose one voting method. It is what within a class of what we call ordinal system. So with ranked choice voting, also known as instant runoff voting, you are providing more information, and more of that information is being used. So and that clearly makes it stand apart from our current choose one voting method, which is really bottom of the barrel in terms of terribleness. So there's a distinction between instant runoff voting and our choose one voting method. What are the pros of plurality voting? Are there any? And then Colin is using like the kind of the leading with perhaps simplicity, and I would say that that's probably right in terms of what you're getting with our choose one voting method. There's maybe familiarity because everybody's used to using this. There's simplicity, so it's pretty easy to do. You're just choosing one candidate, and there's also some technical administrative advantages if we're really trying to rack up pros for plurality voting's short list of positives. Another one would be precinct summability, which means that you don't need to have all the ballot data together in one place. So if, say, you've got a bunch of precincts within like a state or some jurisdiction, you can take the totals of each of the jurisdictions and add them together. You don't need to put all of those in one place before you start the counting process. So there are some advantages of that way. But it's not the only voting method that has those advantages. So for instance, approval voting also has precinct summability as an advantage. It's also very easy. In fact, it's harder to spoil your ballot with an approval voting ballot versus plurality voting, because with our choose one voting method or plurality voting, if you pick more than one, your vote is spoiled and it's not valid. But under approval voting, you can choose as many candidates as you want, and you're not spoiling your ballot. So in some instances, like even approval voting has a step ahead of it on the choose one voting method. But those are really the three instances that I can think of the positives for plurality voting. All right, and taking a quick peek through here. Is it possible to counter the center squeeze effect by adding candidates outside the center? Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose you technically could, if you added like a super extreme candidate to the. So if we go back to the list of plurality voting failures, if you added, say, like another candidate, and let me see if I can. There's one nice simulator here that y'all can use. It was developed by a person who works at Google named Ka-Ping Yi. There's some really nice visualizations, and so I don't want to hoard all the fun here. So I'm going to share this with you. And this is actually the tool that we use to make the simulation. And so if you, I suspect, and I played around with this tool quite a bit before, I suspect if you add another candidate not too far outside of the extreme candidates, it could change the winner. But I don't know. It's still kind of challenging there because even with that, it's maybe a bit unclear. It could be even kind of more strange in terms of the outcome. But that's something that you can play with yourself. And as you add more candidates to that field, you can see some of the oddities that can occur there, and you can see that both under the choose one voting method, as well as with there's some interesting experiments that you can do with instant runoff voting as well on there, which let me see what they call it. They might call it the Hare method under there, but let me see. And yeah, they call it Hare/IRB. So that's the name for ranked choice voting under that simulation tool. That's fun to play with there as well, because there you can see some of the anomalies that can occur with that system, where you can make a candidate move more towards the base of support and wind up having them lose, which is kind of a weird thing for a voting method to do. And looking some more at the questions. So one question is asking about the differences between approval voting and our choose one voting method. So again, with our choose one voting method, also known as plurality voting or first past the post, with that, you're choosing just one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. With approval voting, you are picking as many candidates as you want, and the candidate with the most votes wins. So picking as many as you want versus choosing just one. Those are really the differences between those two voting methods, but the outcomes change dramatically. So moving a bit more, and you can see a bit more into the depth of approval voting with the article shared in the comments. So looking back at our list of the top 5, we can take a peek at barrier to entry. So one interesting component that really comes about as a consequence of some of the other drawbacks of plurality voting is that you get this artificial measure of support that's often artificially low relative to a candidate's actual support. And the reason that's the case is because people don't want to, people are afraid of throwing their vote away, supporting candidates who they actually like, because they feel like they're not going to be able to kind of gain the traction that they need in order to be competitive or win in an election. And that reappears in polls as well. So when you get this call or whatever during dinner time, and you have this pollster asking you who you're going to wind up voting for, they're asking you the one candidate traditionally that you're going to vote for, because they're trying to make a prediction. They're trying to capture information to make a prediction of what's going to happen on election day. And when they do that, people are talking about doing the in most cases the same kinds of tactics that they would use on election day, which is often not supporting the candidate that they really like. And as a consequence, having those candidates get an artificially low amount of support. And so that's being reflected in the polls themselves. And so when you're looking at polls and you're seeing third parties and independents in terms of how they're appearing, that polling data is being used to make important decisions. So for instance, if we think about, say, the Commission on Presidential Debates, they have their criterion as you have to have at least 15% in these polls across 5 national polls in order to be able to get into the debate. But they're using this plurality voting method as the measurement instrument to figure out that gauge. And so as a consequence, a lot of these candidates are falling short. And it's not because they don't have the support there. It's because the voting method that we're using just does this terrible job of capturing and measuring the support. And as a consequence, they're getting marginalized. They're not getting invited to these debates because they're using this really bad measurement, like this bad measuring stick, to determine who gets in. And it's not just the debate commission at the national level, and as well as at the local level too. We see polls referenced as an instrument to decide who gets in these debates across the U.S. at the local level, state level, national level. And so this voting method that we're using is also acting as a bar for entry for being able to participate in democracy and being able to share these ideas. And in addition to that, we're aware of the role that money plays in politics, but uh, one of the components there is that there's also a lot of free media advertisement that a lot of major mainstream candidates are able to really leverage and take advantage of. But if you're using a voting method that allows uh, these candidates this uh, to get marginalized in terms of their support, it becomes very easy for the media to be able to marginalize them as well. And if they get marginalized in the media, that means that they've lost out on all this earned media that has incredible value for them, that could really make up the difference for candidates who don't have the same kind of funding backing as other candidates. So this artificially low measure of support has all kinds of consequences. It prevents candidates from being able to gain traction as well, from being able to be taken seriously. It makes it easy for media to marginalize them, and it makes it so that they often are not invited to these debates, so that candidates aren't able to have their ideas heard. And as a candidate, if you can't get your ideas heard, then good luck gaining any kind of traction and moving forward. All right, so looking back at the comments, yeah, so Brian asks, does anyone else feel that once you're in favor of approval voting, virtually every grievance expressed in the world of politics traces to the failings of plurality voting? And Tara responds big time. And I think that's something that a lot of folks who have followed our work at the Center for Election Science have really just experience all the time, like looking at the media, thinking like, oh, well, why didn't that candidate win? Why didn't that candidate get airtime? Well, they were using plurality voting to gauge their support, or plurality voting caused the vote splitting that caused this extreme candidate to win. We we're there's just so much that traces back to this issue. So it's hard. Like once you learn about how terrible our choose one voting method is, and particularly when there are good solutions out there, like for instance at the Center for Election Science, we advocate for approval voting. It's a very simple method, allows you to pick as many candidates as you want, and really addresses a lot of the issues that we've discussed so far, looking at plurality voting. So if we go through the highlights of our list here, and we think, okay, well, what about inexpressiveness? Well, compared to plurality voting, approval voting lets you pick and choose and show your support for multiple candidates, not just one. So it's already more expressive. The spoiler effect. Well, under approval voting, when you pick as many candidates as you want, you can always support your honest favorite candidate no matter what. So if you're back in 2000 and you say, hey, I like Nader more than I like Bush and Gore, I want to be able to support Nader. But at the same time, I also want to make sure that Nader doesn't act as a spoiler, so I want to support Gore as well. Well, in that case, you can support Nader and you can support Gore at the same time, which completely addresses the spoiler effect. Favorite betrayal, again, not an issue. Like you can always support your honest favorite. If you liked Nader in that election, you could support Nader. Number two, partisan winners. Here, like you can, if you imagine a more crowded field, and here we're going back to the that top 5 list under plurality voting, and here we imagine candidates in the center. Well, here if we look at the candidate in the center there, well, for voters in the center left and center right, it makes sense for them to also support the candidate in the middle too, because they want to hedge their bets against some more extreme candidate who they don't agree with winning. And so by this incentive to hedge one's bets also makes it so that the winner itself is one who is more broadly accepted by the electorate as a whole. And so by addressing that vote splitting, particularly around the middle, it tends towards a more consensus winner and avoids this partisan winner. And that's something that also helps with, if we think about the importance of the type of structure of government. We don't want a type of government that has this wild pendulum effect that swings from year to year, where one administration is undoing all the policies that the previous administration is doing. If we're using a voting method that captures and is able to favor this more consistent style candidate in the middle, it makes continuity of government a whole lot easier. You can do long-term planning in a way that is extremely challenging under our current voting method, when you can't tell which wild end of the spectrum is going to be able to be elected from one election to the next. And then finally, the barrier to entry. And here it's really, and here we're kind of recapping and looking at the plurality voting, its terribleness, and then comparing it to the method that we advocate for, which is approval voting. The barrier to entry is something that approval voting really addresses well in a way that is challenging for even other alternative voting methods. So one way that we can see that is if we look at the Super Tuesday poll that we had done, and really, this is something that we see really robust in the literature and with polling. So we did the same thing in November. Earlier in the Democratic primary, we did this in 2016. When we look at French studies, we see the same thing, and that is under approval voting, we see candidates, even ones who don't win, they get a much more accurate reflection of support that is otherwise completely invisible under our current choose one plurality voting method. And even compared to some of the alternatives. So for instance, if we think about instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting, and I'll put in a link for that, even though that method is clearly better than the choose one voting method that we use now, it simply does not do nearly anywhere as good of a job as approval voting does, engaging the support for other candidates who don't win. And you can see that very clearly in the Super Tuesday poll, as well as the earlier one that we did as well. And I'll go ahead and share the earlier one, the early 2020 Democratic primary as well. And here what we did with those studies is we asked people, okay, we asked likely Democratic voters, you're going to be voting in this upcoming primary, who would you vote for? And while you're considering that question, we're going to ask you how you would vote under multiple different voting methods. We asked people under choose one, the first past the post system, under approval voting, and under ranked choice voting. And when we did that, and we compared it to these control measures where we asked people to be honest about their assessments, we saw that approval voting did much better in terms of matching that support with these control measures, these honest assessment measures, than any other voting method that we asked about. It did it way better than first past the post, and it also did it way better than ranked choice voting. And so when we're thinking about the drawbacks of our choose one voting method from that top 5 list, that barrier to entry one is huge, because under approval voting, we're now able to capture support in a way that our choose one voting method never could. And as a constant, and that makes a huge difference, because now when we think about things like earned media, it's much harder for media to get away with marginalizing a candidate like they can when they're getting this pittance of support. But under approval voting, if they're getting that accurate reflection of support, you can't marginalize them the same way and say like, hey, this candidate, nobody likes this candidate, if they're actually getting support and it's being measured under approval voting. So you can't marginalize candidates the same way. It's also harder to exclude them from debates as well. So if you're using this common metric of, well, how well would they do under the voting method that we're going to be using in the election? Well, if that voting method is approval voting and you're capturing their support, so using polling, then they're going to get that support if they're worthy of a candidate. And if we look and say back at the 2016 election, there again we compared multiple different voting methods, and that particular poll that we had done, if we keep in mind the 15% threshold, Gary Johnson in that poll got roughly 21% under approval voting, which going by the Commission of Presidential Debate Standards, that would have been enough to get him in for the debate. And so we're seeing that under approval voting, you can't marginalize unfairly candidates like you can under our current choose one voting method. And it's not to say, and you can look at some of that data too. For instance, some of those polls, you can look at some of them and you can see like, well, like some candidates don't do very well under plurality voting or approval voting. Well, the sometimes candidates are just not very good or aren't a very good fit for a particular electorate. And you can look at the control measures and you see them also perform poorly under a control measure. So just because we're using a better voting method doesn't mean that that every candidate is going to get great support. They still have to earn that support, and that's something to be mindful of. So I'm going to look back into the comments. Yeah, so we're looking at the viability of third parties. Absolutely the case. And what's interesting about third parties, and this is from looks like Arthur is mentioning, Arthur Thomas the fourth is talking about third parties, and so absolutely. And one thing to keep in mind too is that, and this just reiterates how important it is to have a voting method that accurately captures the measure of support for candidates, even when they don't win. So one thing that a major party candidate can do, if they're looking at the alternatives that are in the field within the race that they're in, and they're saying like, hey, it looks like this candidate within this third party, they keep talking about this idea, and I'm seeing it resonate, and they keep getting more support. And I think they might be closing in on me overall, and I want to win this race. And so one thing that a major party candidate can do if they see some third party or independent candidate move up is that they can co-opt those ideas, and they could say like, you know what, this person has proven themselves in terms of this idea that they're pushing. I'm just going to say this is part of my platform now too. And while for a third party or independent who may not have actually won at all in that election, they do get a pretty big prize at the end of the day, which is they could have a major party candidate or the ultimate winner co-opt their idea. And so that's a pretty nice parting prize, even though they didn't get to win the office. They're getting their ideas traction in a way that would have been impossible under our current choose one voting method. So that's good. That I'm glad people are thinking about the way that it allows third parties and independents who can bring new ideas to the table, allowing them to gain traction and also build off of themselves. So say like you're using approval voting and like it's a city for the first time, which we're going to be seeing in Fargo this year and in future elections as well, if St. Louis is able to win and implement approval voting. And so you can look at those elections and say like, hey, like, well, how did the Libertarian Party candidate or the Green Party candidate do this year, or the independent who is running? If you're seeing that they got a good amount of support, so like say they got like 20 or 30% approval, well, during that next race when they're coming in, they can build on that support. But you can't build on support when your support is like 2% under our current choose one voting method. You just can't go anywhere with that. All right, so I'm looking back to the comments again. Yeah, so there are also, so Tara's mentioning some of the instant runoff voting issues. Instant runoff voting, and here looking at the kind of center squeeze effect that we talked about with plurality voting. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting does do better than our current choose one voting method with regard to the center squeeze effect. But it still is vulnerable to that effect as well. And so I shared that tool, which, by the way, this is a fun little tool. You'll probably spend some time playing around with it. This is the one from the Zesty the Zesty webpage and the URL that you see in the chat window. And so you can go and play around with that using there's see if I can find another simulation tool, which is pretty fun too, just for everybody to play around with. And I should be able to, yep, there we go. Cool. And here's another fun one by Nikki Case, as long as folks are looking for fun stuff to play with. And one of the interesting things with ranked choice voting, like you would look at that and think like maybe intuitively, well, if my first, so as a recap, like with ranked choice voting and instant runoff voting, I'm gonna explain how it works. So normally with instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting, when you are the information that you provide is ranking for all the candidates. So you rank the candidate that you like the most, rank them first, and then go on down from there if you're expressing information honestly. And then the other component is the calculation. So the way that works is you look to see if any candidate has more than half of the first choice preferences of those votes. If yes, you've got a winner. If not, you look to the candidate with the fewest first choice votes, look to their next choice preference, and then eliminate that candidate, transfer the ballot over to the next choice preference, treat that as first choice preference now, and then go through that tabulation and say, okay, well, now does any candidate have more than half the first choice preferences? If yes, you've got a winner. If no, you keep doing that cycle over and over again until you have someone with more than half of the first choice preferences. So that's a recap on how instant runoff voting works. And so you might think, well, if these vote transfers are happening, then I shouldn't have to worry about some kind of center squeeze effect or vote splitting. Well, it still happens. It just happens in a little bit of a more complicated way. And so if we go, and you can play around with that tool, there's a one with like a multi-dimensional axis that Nikki Case has, that I shared in the chat box, and then there's the other one that's a little bit simpler with the Zesty by copying Yi with the Zesty link on there. And so you can play around with that, and you also look at the like you can add the number of candidates that are there. But what's interesting there is that you can still create that center squeeze effect. And the reason that happens is because if you put a candidate in the middle there, and you're putting candidates on either side, you're still seeing vote splitting, but you're seeing vote splitting of first choice preferences. And so if a candidate has their vote split of first choice preferences split so that they have the fewest first choice preferences, they're still getting knocked out in a very similar way that we see vote splitting occurring with plurality voting, albeit that is mitigated across a number of different circumstances, but it's still a real problem. And we can see that real problem, and we've seen it come up in actual elections. There was a classic election in Burlington, Vermont, where there was a center squeeze effect that happened that caused someone on farther on the left to win, when a more moderate candidate in the middle was really the best candidate to win in that election. That happened under a ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting election. And we could also see that happen within a traditional runoff type election, where the mechanics would have worked out the same as with instant runoff voting. And that was with a 1991 Louisiana gubernatorial election, which was kind of a strange election where you had an incumbent, another candidate who was a bit more on the left, who was like marred with all kinds of racketeering charges, and then you had another candidate on the right, David Duke, who was just a classic racist, who was in the Klan, and so you had this kind of very wild and strange dynamic, and as a consequence, Buddy Roemer, because of this center squeeze effect and this vote splitting, got the fewest votes and didn't make it to the runoff in that election, where the marred candidate on the left, and then the David Duke on the right, were able to move forward. Whereas when we're able to look at that data and say, okay, well, this candidate in the center really was the one, Buddy Roemer was the one who was able to beat other candidates head to head, and really the voting method unfairly pushed him out early. So going back to the comments, let's see. a comment about Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia is an awesome resource. So I strongly recommend people look at Ballotpedia. I look at it all the time. It's great from whether you are looking up candidates or looking at just kind of general research about elections. It's really, really a great place to look. So Tara asked a hypothetical. So what if the center squeeze effect isn't inherently bad? So yeah, so and Tara's looking at it and say, okay, well, is the center squeeze effect bad? Like just kind of as a fundamental question. Um, and so she's talking about advocating for election results that make the populace the happiest. So one interesting thing about approval voting is it's within a class of voting methods called cardinal systems, which focuses more on utility. And when we think about the definition of utility, it really is trying to maximize happiness to the greatest extent possible. So if that's our goal, we're in the right class of voting methods to try to accomplish that goal. And within the and if we're thinking about the Cinder squeeze effect, also that candidate in the middle really is the one that's appealing to the broadest breadth of the electorate in terms of maximizing people's happiness. And it may be a little bit simplified on that copying Yi diagram, the one with the zesty URL. But even if we take that and say you look at Nikki Case's work, which again, that's a fun tool to play with. Nikki Case has a sandbox on there. Spend a bunch of time there, goofing around with different scenarios. It's a lot of fun. But you can see with Nikki Cases, you can see that on multiple dimensions. And so there, the center squeeze is like you imagine something like what we call a Nolan chart in political science, where we're looking at ideology across 2 dimensions, where the center is just like here on the Nolan chart here. And so you can see this same kind of center squeeze effect occur in multiple dimensions as well. And you can, if you use that tool, you can place little candidates along that, like in this political space, and see the center squeeze effect happen there as well. And you see the same thing with approval voting. Approval voting will still favor towards the center of where the voters are concentrated, even if you add another axis there. So with the Zesty type tool, you're seeing it simplified across one axis, whereas with the one by Nikki Case, you can see it in a little bit more of a complex scenario. Although Nikki does a great job taking a more complicated scenario and making it as simple as possible. What Nikki did was really hard to do. So really look to their work and being able to play around with that. So looking a bit more with the comments here. And also feel free to chime in with other questions too. And if I'm not seeing your question from before, feel free to add it again. Yep. It's ElectoWiki. That's a fun one. Oh, here's an interesting one by Björk Ebert. So could one state adopt approval voting for a presidential election, and how could that be implemented nationwide? And this is interesting. So in these, we have kind of a really funny way of electing our president using the Electoral College. But it's also kind of weird because the way that electoral votes are assigned is really up to the state individually. And so you kind of have this kind of weird system with the Electoral College, but at the same time, the state itself has a lot of flexibility in terms of how they assign those votes. And so you could have an individual state using approval voting just as a standalone without any other states doing it. So that's possible. for a state to do that. A state completely has that power to be able to decide how it as a state votes on the US president, and choosing how that affects how its electoral votes are allocated. It becomes a little tricky though. So like, for instance, you may be able to have approval voting within a state favor a candidate who maybe wouldn't do well under plurality voting. And so that may cause, like, by nesting approval voting within the electoral college as a whole could create some complexities, and that it may disincentivize people to vote under approval voting the way that they would normally if approval voting was a standalone, because the idea of not wanting to send electoral votes to a candidate who wouldn't do well throughout the rest of the nation as a whole. So it becomes a little bit tricky when you are nesting approval voting within another system without kind of changing the whole system as a whole. There's a little bit more of a so kind of segueing to the other part of the question, which is, so first, you can do it at the state level just as a standalone. The other part of the question is, well, can you do it nationwide? And there is an interesting movement to change the way that we elect the president to a national popular vote. And I will share that link with you right here. This is the National Popular Vote Plan. You can read up on it right there. And I'll just summarize how that works. So the National Popular Vote Plan, and this integrates with how technically like approval voting could coincide with this. So the National Popular Vote Plan is a compact between states. So states can make agreements between each other, in all the same way individuals can make a contract between each other. And so each state passes through its legislature basically this contract that it's going and binding itself to. And what that contract says is that the state itself will go ahead and assign its electoral votes to whatever the national popular vote was. So imagine the California. So imagine like California is using this. This triggers when enough states sign on so that their total electoral votes total to 270. Once that trigger happens, the electoral votes from that state automatically go to whatever the national popular vote winner is. So as an example, imagine you have an election and California is signed onto this, so we can use California as an example. So imagine you have an election where the national popular vote winner is the Republican candidate. California goes the same way every time, always goes Democrat. And so, but here, say it's signed on to the National Popular Vote Compact, California would assign its electoral votes to the Republican candidate because the Republican candidate in this scenario that we're talking about or envisioning is the national popular vote winner. And so it just ensures that the national popular vote winner is the one that wins by making states assign their electoral votes that way. And so that's how the National Popular Vote Compact works. And you can use this with approval voting. In fact, among all the different voting methods that are out there, I think approval voting is really the only alternative voting method that would work with the national popular vote. Because at the end of the day, like it's pretty clear in a lot of ways that the Electoral College is not a way to, say, maximize utility for the electorate. But even with that, like if we say like, okay, well, say the National Popular Vote Plan works and we are using that, if that's the case, we're still using this choose one plurality voting method, which is the worst voting method that there is. And so it's technically an improvement, but it's can have another compact so that states that sign on to it are using approval voting, for instance, and approval voting would work here. And the reason it would work because of two factors that are unique to approval voting compared to other alternative voting methods. One is that approval voting, like we mentioned before, is that it is precinct summable. And what that means is that you don't need to have all the ballot data from all 50 states who are using different systems. You don't need to have all that together. You can have totals from individual precincts and then take those totals together. and be able to calculate a winner. You can't do that, for instance, with ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting. Ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting would just not work with the interstate compact with the National Popular Vote Plan. It would be extremely complicated. Even if you were kind of getting away with that, you'd have a lot of complexity there. So approval voting works really well because of its precinct sumability. Another reason that approval voting works well within this particular plan, say the National Popular Vote Plan, is because you can calculate approval voting votes and aggregate them with our current choose one votes at the same time. So you can take that data because they look so similar and put them together. And you need to be able to do that because say you're using this National Popular Vote Plan and you're trying to integrate approval voting at the same time, you're not going to have all the states do this at once. Even when the plan becomes enacted and you have that trigger of 270 electoral votes, that's still not all the states signed on to this. You still have a bunch of states using plurality voting or this choose one voting method, and you have to be able to tabulate and use that information too to be able to figure out who the National Popular Vote Plan, National Popular Vote winner is. And so with approval voting, you can take those approval voting ballots, that information that people cast, and you can tabulate it alongside the holdout states that are still using this choose one voting method and take that data together to come up with a national popular vote. And you just can't do that with any other alternative voting method. And so when we're thinking about alternative voting methods and integrating them with the National Popular Vote Plan, you can't do that with any other voting method that I'm aware of aside from approval voting. And that really gives it a really unique trait. So looking back to the comments. So Brian is asking about gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is an issue where you have a bunch of people being elected at the same time. And like we mentioned before, in the US, we do this weird thing with winner take all, where we take all these multi-member districts and we slice them up and we put them into single member districts. And because the people who are elected are the ones who slice them up and put them in these boxes, you can create highly disproportional results, so that one group who draws the lines can exasperate or really leverage their ability to create a win that's even heavier for them. So they win by a landslide, or maybe they wouldn't have won before, but because they're in power and drawing the lines, they make it so that they do win. And so gerrymandering is really an issue that's inherent to single winner districts. When we look at, say, some of the research out there, I'm thinking about Douglas Amy, in particular, who's done a lot of work on proportional representation. When we look and see countries that use the single winner take all framework, we see what are called these false majorities roughly 40% of the time. And a false majority is when a group that gets, say, less than half of the votes, they get more than half of the seats, or vice versa. A group that gets more than half of the votes, they get fewer than half of the seats. So these false majorities come up a lot with winner take all, and so like this is just something kind of inherent. If we look at, say, like Canada, Canada gets these false majorities, has gotten a number of them in recent elections, and they use independent commissions. So they have independent commissions draw these lines, and still the last two elections they've had these false majorities. If we're looking at this and saying that what is wrong here is that we're getting groups that are getting an unfair amount of representation, whether that be too much or too little, then really what we're saying is that the representation should be proportional in terms of their support. And there's a whole class of systems that does exactly that, and these are called proportional voting methods. There's a whole bunch of them. So there's, you see, list is a common one that you see in European countries where uh, someone supports a party on their ballot, and let's say it's Libertarian Party, and 20% of people support Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party would get roughly 20% of the seats. And you can also use it for like a multi-winner district-based system, and approval voting also works within that context. So I just shared a proportional approval voting article in there, which you can see some of the ways that plays out. And so one thing to keep in mind too is that if you're in a district, and like I mentioned before, if you vote for someone and they only get 40% of the vote, and say there are only two people running and the other person got 60%, you really get nothing out of that, even though 40% of the electorate feel like they're not being represented. And proportional representation directly addresses that. Right. And so I'm looking back to the comments, seeing if we've got any other questions. So Brian's Howard is talking about kind of informal decision making. Things like, well, like you're out with a bunch of friends, where do you eat? Approval voting is really a great solution there. It's very easy. So one thing that I've seen as a practical matter is that there are all kinds of voting methods out there, some of them pretty complicated. Approval voting just does a wonderful job in terms of performing well as a voting method, and then just being super easy. It's you don't need it's something where it's easy to count. So like if you have, say, like a dozen people with you in a group, and you're trying to figure out where to go, you have you develop a list of options, and then just have people go through and raise their hands. And if they voted for something already, let them raise their hands again. So it's just as simple as that. And you get a nice, simple solution. It's a great way for organizations to make decisions that just doesn't have a lot of resistance like you can have with other voting methods. Sometimes if you try to uh, come up with, say, like a super sophisticated voting method, and maybe it even performs a little bit better than approval voting. For that little extra ounce of utility, you have to think, well, is it really worth it to do that at the risk of perhaps not having any change at all because people don't like the complexity, or something that's just people are going to give up on because they don't feel like going through with it. Um, so going through and looking at other questions here. Yeah, so Tara is talking about uh, the naming of voting methods. We tend to use descriptive naming with plurality voting or approval voting, by calling it choose one voting. Although technically there is a semi-proportional voting method, and you can check out our glossary if you're looking for more. There's a semi-proportional voting method called single non-transferable vote that has you choose only one voting method, but choose only one candidate when you're electing multiple candidates at the same time. But people typically don't get these confused. So we've been able to get away with calling it a choose one voting method. Yeah, so there is one. Let me see if I can find the article here. Let's see. I'm not sure if I can think off the top of my head the article that goes into why. Well, maybe I can. So there's one question in there asking a little bit more of a sophisticated question about why a particular reweighting formula is used over others. And you can find the discussion for that in this article. This is using, so Brian's asking, I think it was Brian who asked the question about that. There's one about, oh, uh, one person is asking about sequential proportional approval voting. why Jefferson reweighting versus Webster. And I just shared an article looking at a method that is very similar called the excess method, that is a little bit more complicated, that goes into why it makes sense in this particular scenario to choose one allocation formula versus another. And it's looking at the reweighting for ballots across across rounds as each candidate is being elected. But it's kind of complicated to go into, so I'm just going to share the article in the chat for that. And that one is written. One of the authors on that is Stephen Brams, who's one of our advisors as well. All right, so scrolling through. So author Thomas IV asks about multi-seat races with approval voting, just picking the top vote getters. Now, there's something. So this is an interesting component. So a lot of times when we're talking about approval voting, when we're talking about approval voting and electing, we're traditionally talking about using it within the context of a single winner election, and so. But you can also use it within multi-winner elections, and I shared before the issue there with being able to use sequential proportional approval voting. But intuitively, a lot of people look at it and say, like, well, why don't we just go ahead and say approve all the candidates that you want, and then I'm electing 5 people, so I just take the top 5 vote getters. Well, you can do that, but when you do that, the group that you have winning is going to be pretty homogenous. So they're all going to look pretty much the same. They're going to be good winners, and that they're going to be around the center of the electorate, which is good. But you're not getting a whole lot of diversity, which is excuse me for a second. Which is something that if you want that, then you need to use a proportional voting method. And so, but if you use it in terms of like just selecting the top 5 vote getters, you're using what's called a block method, and you're not going to see a lot of diversity there. All right, and let's see here. Going back to the chat. And I think that's about all the questions that we have. Try to make this go not too long. We've gone about an hour and a half, so I think we're probably going to wrap it up. So some things to keep in mind. So as we are a nonprofit, so what you can do is donate to us, as we're a 501c3. If you like the work that we're doing, we study and advance better voting methods. We also work with local groups to advance better voting methods, particularly approval voting in cities. So if you'd like to see more of that, you can go to electionscience.org. We make our donate button pretty prominent, so you can go on there. Also, something to keep in mind is that the CARES Act that was passed this year has some interesting benefits for people who are donating to charities. So there is now an above the line deduction. So if you don't do any kind of itemization, you have an above the line deduction available for you of up to $300. That's not something that's usual. You may not ever see that again. So if you'd like to send that $300 to the Center for Election Science and give yourself a top of the line deduction, that's pretty easy. May not be available in the future. And the caps for cash deductions, if you do itemization, there are no limits this year. So if you really want to open your wallet, you can do that. We also want to encourage people who say, like, if you think about your employer, a bunch of employers have matching. And so if you don't know already, I would strongly encourage you to ask your employer whether they have matching for, let me see. And so there's one person asking, oh yeah. So if you go to our website, there's take action, and you can see more of some other places to connect with us. And so So yep. So if you look up your employer and you don't know whether they have matching, I strongly encourage you to ask. If they don't have it, you may ask to see if you can get that as a benefit. It is awesome, really. So a lot of organizations, like I think, for instance, Google this year, their match is they've moved up their match to 2 to 1. So if you say their max is like $10,000, so if you say you gave a $10,000 gift, Google this year would match it 2 to 1, so they would put 20,000 of Google's money on top of the $10,000 that you gave. So it's really an effective way to give, and that helps us to advance our work to make sure that you're not using this terrible voting method that we've gone so long today, talking about how terrible it is, and uh, and also recognizing that we don't want to use this terrible voting method to decide who sits at the seat to spend countless tax dollars and to determine the policies that govern our day-to-day lives. We don't want to have a voting method that does that in a way that makes it so people who are elected don't have our best interests in mind. So I encourage you to donate. I encourage you to look out for those opportunities, employer matching, get that tax deduction this year. If you really want to open your wallets, there are no limits on cash contributions for itemization deductions this year. So I encourage you to look at that. You can also, everyone, I encourage to go to our site as well at the Center for Election Science and sign up for our newsletter. That's really important because you find out about all the events that we're doing. We're doing a lot of virtual events now. And we use that information from people who signed up for the newsletter to figure out the geographic concentration of where people are located. And that helps us figure out where to work with in our next campaigns. And if you notice that like there's not a chapter in your area, you can also go to our website, and I will show the take action part. I just linked to the take action part in general. So if you go to take action here, we've got lots of awesome opportunities there. And then if you just kind of hover over take action at the menu bar, you can see that we've got our chapter program, election tools, and then all kinds of other ways that you can connect with us, including buying merchandise from us. So again, thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us, and stay safe.